Welcome to Beyond the Walls podcast. I'm your host, Kylie, and I am so excited to be able to have this conversation with you to help teach you tools, ideas, support on how to go beyond your walls too. Are you tired of feeling stuck and trapped and like a victim in your own life? Maybe you need to find a new way to look at it. Look at your situation from a different angle. Maybe we need to learn and take a look to see how we can re-choose or recreate a life that is going to bring you joy and purpose and feel free and exciting. So let's get started on today's message. Today, we're going to be talking about the challenges, the hardships of growing up with parents that struggled with addiction. And I have a great guest to introduce with you today, Tammy Vincent. She is a coach herself who has personal experience, and she has generously agreed to share her story and her journey of her childhood growing up, and to be able to share with you just the walls that she has gone beyond and that she helps others to go beyond as well. So let's get into it. Tammy, welcome to the podcast. Tell us about you and just your story. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Kylie. So happy to be here because when you have a story, you have to tell the story because there's always somebody out there listening that can resonate with your story. There's always somebody out there that maybe wants to tell somebody or wants to have a community and wants to talk to somebody, but just doesn't know where to start. And that's kind of where I came in. So my background was tumultuous. I was told from a very young age of 44 or 5 years old, that my parents, my mom especially, told me, I wish you had never been born. I had never brought you into this world. My life would be so much better if you had never come along. I can remember going to hug her and her pushing me away and being like, I don't have time, blah, blah, blah. And that was my very first memories. And things just got worse from there. So it was like right from the beginning, was just starved for that attention, starved for that, anybody I could grab onto. Unfortunately, my father was also an alcoholic. So even though I say he did nothing wrong, emotionally, he really wasn't there to do anything right. He was battling his own demons. He had a really hard time with my mother. I mean, there was mental illness all throughout every generation on her side of the family that I can remember. She was anorexic at 16, 63 pounds on an IV feeder. And she just had all kinds of things she was battling. So my father, even though he was the kindest, gentlest, most sincere soul in the world, I feel like he wasn't available to give us what we needed because he was just in survival mode.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until I was actually about 26 years old, getting ready to have my first child, that the magnitude of what it had done to me hit me. Because have you ever read that book, Love You Forever?
No.
Okay, so
Oh,
it's a
is
very
it the little kids book?
the little kids book. Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so I
Well,
tell
tell the
everybody, if you
audience because they haven't.
yes, I will tell them. So if you've never read it, it's about a mother's unconditional love for her son. And as her son is growing up and going through these terrible stages of being a teenager and the terrible twos and then the toddlers and then all those stages, the mother continues to love this little boy. And she's singing him the song, I love you forever and ever. I'll love you for always, my baby you'll be. Well, at the
Yeah.
end, the tide is turned and now she is old and frail, and he's rocking her back and forth as if she was a baby, and he's singing the same song, but my mommy you'll be. And you would have thought it would have been this like serendipitous, like, oh, this is so sweet, this is so cool. But it hit me like I'm just not even gonna lie, it hit me like a dump truck,
I
like a
imagine.
2x4 in the side of the head, that I had no idea what unconditional love even felt like. I had
Yeah.
never experienced it. So I'm sitting here thinking, like, rocking back and forth, like, what am I going to do? How am I going to raise this baby? I don't know what love is. I don't know how to be a mom. I don't know how to be a
Yeah.
parent. I don't know what happy looks like. I don't know what love looks like. And so that was like the jump start of my catapult into this. I'm going to figure out my life. I knew that the answer
Yeah.
wasn't just doing the opposite of what was done to me, which is what a lot of people I think tend to do.
Yeah.
Like, my mom was mean, so I'm going to be nice. My mom made me do this, so I'm not going to do this. And that's not always the answer either. But if you're not modeled healthy relationships, you don't know what they are.
Yeah.
So over 30 years, I figured out what they were. I mean, I had my first marriage is nothing like my second marriage. I literally had no boundaries. I had people could walk all over me. I didn't have any boundaries, whether they be emotional, financial, sexual, nothing. I had none. Didn't understand it. And now it's literally 30 years later. I've got a box full of tools that I've used and thrown every single thing I could read or get my hands on, thrown it at the wall to see what would stick. And
Wow.
now 30 years later, I have this toolbox of tools, and I'm like, okay, there's other people that are out there that are floundering, that just don't know why even sometimes. And that's what I'm here to do.
Yeah. Wow. That is such, thank you so much for sharing that story. Like, so many questions are coming to my mind of places we could go. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were sharing, like, especially in your response to the book, I thought, like, what were some of those initial feelings? Like, I would speculate that maybe, like, there's got to be some, like, why didn't I get that? Like, that looked nothing like what I had. I missed out. Or even that seems like such a high bar. I don't know if I can do it. Like, is it failure? Is it overwhelm? Was it inspiration? Like, was it your own brokenness, or was it about who you wanted to become for your kids? Like, maybe just fill in some of those
Oh,
blanks.
wow. So I think you said overwhelm and fear and failure, and it was all of that when it started. But my
Yeah.
main goal when it first started was, how do I become a parent? How do I be that person that I never had? Because I didn't know what it looked like. So I read all kinds of parenting books, and I also read all kinds of books on addiction. I mean, I had gone through some stuff. I had attempted to take my own life, so I read books on suicide and how, and it really dawned on me. And I know, it was I used to beg God, like, please tell me, who's going to save me. I don't know why that was my only question I ever asked him, but who's going to save me? And I can remember hearing this, Tammy, Tammy, Tammy. And all throughout my life I was like, really? Like, you're going to mock me? Like, I'm
Mhm.
serious. Like, I pictured this shaking the head,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
was, you're right, like, come on. But
Yeah.
it wasn't until I was on this mission to figure this out that I realized what he was saying is, I'm going to save me. So
Mm.
I have to make the choice in every situation. I'm going to move forward to being a better mom, to being a better person, to being a happier person, to being the best version of myself, or I'm going to stay stuck. And I really, because I did suffer all of those things that children suffer when they grow up in an alcoholic family. They don't feel worthy because they never got the validation. I can remember bringing home a report card, working so hard to get straight A's, figuring if I could just get straight A's, maybe things would be a little calmer. Maybe my parents wouldn't get
Mhm.
mad at me for a while. And I can remember my father just kind of being like, yeah, nice. My mother not caring at all. And my
Yeah.
father basically saying, I think the comment was something to the effect of, it's about time you use that brain. Let's see how long that lasts. And it's like,
Mm.
wow. So it's like nothing was ever good enough, no matter how hard I tried. And
Yeah.
all that follows into your
Yeah.
adulthood. But as far as, missing out on yeah, I missed out. I'm not going to lie. I didn't have a loving family. I didn't have, I don't remember most of my childhood, as far as very few vacations that I remember. Um, I remember the morning, Christmas morning, there was so much joy. And then by 2 o'clock, there was fighting and yelling and drinking and
Mm.
throwing things. And it was like every day that started joyous ended horrifically. So yeah, it was nice when I got a family to actually enjoy that. But I really realize I can't live in the past. I have to heal
Mm.
from the past, and I have to change what happened to me physically and mentally, but I can't live there.
Yeah, I think one, hearing what you're sharing about even like the God basically saying, like, you need to participate in this with me, right? Like,
Mhm.
somehow severing that dynamic of, like, your parents don't define you, your past doesn't define you. Like, they're not deal breakers, they're not walls to hide behind, they're not the end of the story. right? And I hear in your, because, I didn't have that upbringing that you had, but I still found myself at the same crossroads at one point of having to choose to believe, like, am I going to believe who God says I am? Am I going to believe that, like, I have value and I have worth and I have a say in the matter, right? Instead of just being a victim in our lives, like, how do we, like, participate and actually say, like, okay, who am I going to say that I am, and what is in my control, and be brave enough to rewrite that story,
Right.
right? And so I imagine, like, man, what age or how far into it did you feel like, was there just like a black and white transformation of, like, I'm not going to let my parents, I'm thinking specifically in your story where your mom's telling you that it would be better off if you weren't here, right? Like, where your mom is actively telling you, you don't have value, you've ruined my life, you'd be better off not here. Like, somehow, like, just cutting that off, or does it still haunt you? Like, how was that transformation or baby steps?
Well, I think it started so young for me. And I know a lot of people out there listening, if you've never heard of kind of progression that your mind takes up until
Mhm.
about 7 to 8 years of age, you're literally going through this kind of semi hypnotic state. You're not making your own thoughts. You're not processing. You're just, your brain and your mind is not mature enough to do that. So all you're doing is taking external things and sucking it in. That's all you're doing. And you're trying to make sense of that in your brain. But that is why it follows you into adulthood, because what those things became to me were the subconscious limiting belief that I am not good enough, I am not worthy, I am not loved, meaning I am not lovable. I mean, our brains want to protect us, they want to keep us safe. So, no way is my brain going to say at 7 years old, hey, my parents are drinking, that's why they don't pay attention to me. You're never going to admit in your brain that the one person or two people that are supposed to care for you and keep you safe are wrong. So it all turns around and it internalizes that you're wrong. It must be me.
Yeah.
So you don't consciously make those decisions at that age. You don't
Yeah.
consciously make those decisions until much, much later, but they're with you. Your brain has already told yourself. So when you go to act and you say, hey, you get your first job and they say you're going to make $4 an hour, you don't go, no, I deserve 5. You go, okay. And you put your
Mhm.
head down because you believe you're not worthy to do anything more. So you
Yeah.
become this. I always say I was the best chameleon ever.
Mm.
I was amazing. People, I remember my therapist, well, who are you? I'm like, who do you need me to be? I'm whatever you
Mm.
need me to be right now. I'm whoever you need me to be because I don't even know who I am. But it wasn't, and that's why these podcasts are so good and that's why they're so important, because there's people out there listening right now that if you say, who are you? They're going to say, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a mother, I'm a this. No, who are you? What do you like? And there's millions of us walking around that don't know,
Yeah. Yeah.
that don't know. So
Yeah.
these messages are so important because until you're told that it's okay to live the life that you were born to
Yeah.
act out the life that God gave you, you don't know.
Yeah.
So it was when I was 20. It was actually after I was 26. I would say probably my early 30s,
Okay.
to where I finally was like, you know what? Enough is enough. People can't talk to me that way. People can't act to me that way. If I want to eat a peanut butter sandwich and someone's telling me I don't like jelly, and I do, by
Yeah.
golly, I'm going to have my jelly because
Yeah.
it really. And it was
Yes.
my early 30s. It was 20
Wow.
20 some years ago. But
Yeah.
the first time I set a boundary, whew, how liberating. How
Wow.
liberating to stand up for myself and then get the respect after doing it.
Tell us more. Maybe describe that for the people that are like, we're so afraid. Like, what were you actually afraid of, if you can remember those moments of, like, the exact fears or the upset? Like, what was it actually about? How did you know that that was the boundary you were going to make? And then what did it feel like on the other side? Were you met with support, or were you met with resistance even? Because I
I
think that's even a distinction too. Like, even though we've set boundaries, then you got to deal with people's reactions to it. And that's a whole other story. So, but tell us first about your first
My
boundary setting.
very first my very first one was when I was in college, honestly, and I was working at a restaurant and I needed time off to go see my father, and I wanted to go home and they said no for some stupid reason. And I was like, I remember calling my dad and saying, I can't come. They said no. And he's like, you go into your boss and you just tell her I requested off like everybody else in the world. And I was I was shaking. I was
Yeah.
shaking to confront someone voluntarily. I had never confronted anybody voluntarily. Like if it was confrontation, I ran. I ran as fast as I could run. And I remember going in and I was like, "Listen, I put in my request like everybody else, and I don't understand." And she gave me like three or four, and I was shaking so hard. She gave me three or four reasons why, and I was like, "But I did this and I did this and I did that and I don't get it. And you know what? My father needs me." And I was like,
Yeah.
"So let me know." And I walked out of the office and she came out and she's like, "You can have the time." And I was like, "Yeah." Like, I mean, it was kind of weird, but I was like in my heart, I was jumping up and down. But boy, let me tell you even more than that. It's like when I grew up, I always kind of slouched and it wasn't that I had bad posture. My parents spent my whole life putting their thumbs in my shoulders, like, "Put your shoulders back."
Oh, wow.
But when I remember the feeling of sitting up straight for that first time, and it was like I poofed out my chest like a big chicken or rooster or whatever that was, and it was crazy. It was like almost I can honestly say it was almost like the first deep, deep breath I had
Mm,
taken as long as I could remember.
yeah. Wow.
And
That's a great story.
yeah, it was, and the confidence. So then I was like, wow, well, if I can do that, maybe I can, and I was in college, so I mean, it wasn't like that was the end all, and all of a sudden I was this cured,
Yes.
non people pleasing thing. I continued to get married to someone that talked to me like they shouldn't, and things like that. But
Yes.
boundaries are tough to start, and
Yeah.
that's why, if
Yeah.
for the people out there listening, if you've never had them or you've never stood up for yourself, I heard a great suggestion from someone the other day is start small. Go to a restaurant and order something that's not on the menu.
Oh, bold.
You know what I mean? You got to start small. And like you said, I was hit with resistance. Now, had that been a family member, like let's say I was going home to tell my dad that I didn't want him to drink in front of me, like that
Mm,
never would have gone over well because I
yeah.
wasn't. You have to like make your pros. I mean, I had a pro list, a con list. I'm all about lists
Yeah.
and what can possibly happen, but start small.
Yeah.
Be,
Yes. And I think knowing too, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, that it's not like you were just cured and then it became easy. Because I think we all get confused or easily discouraged when we're in this process of trying to grow and mature and kind of heal from a lot of those things. Like, we want it to be one and done, we want it to then just be easy. And it's like it takes so much energy and hurt to start at the first path, and then you do it, but it's not like it just becomes your identity overnight.
Well, yeah, there is absolutely no one and done for anything when it comes to healing. I mean, it literally took decades to get there, sometimes
Yeah.
10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of just this constant negativity and reprogramming, like just wrong programming. And so it's going to take some time to undo it. But you have to give yourself some grace. I mean, that's really the biggest thing because
Yeah.
when you go back and you start being too tough on yourself, it becomes this vicious shame cycle. And that is just as hard to break. So when
Yeah.
it might have taken, it took me, there were certain things like the concept of forgiveness took me forever because
Mhm.
people were constantly saying, it's just your mom. How can you be so angry? It's your mom. And
Yeah.
and so even after I had to forgive her, then I still had to go back and forgive myself because there's also a lot of my part in this that I had to look at. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
self reflecting. It's a whole process. But every step forward that you take is one step closer to that. I just call it emotional freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. And we all need that, right? The emotional freedom to be somebody new. That makes me think of how much or how difficult was it as you are then becoming a parent, right? So as you shared in your story, it really was like that moment of you preparing to become a parent that really helps you hit your like rock bottom. Like enough is enough. I got
Right.
to figure this out. But then as you're becoming a parent, what was like the hardest part for you? Or was it shame? Was it fear? Was it comparison that was like kind of, did something haunt you as you were a parent? Or did you have kind of the emotional freedom to be whatever parent you ended up becoming, as opposed to like resisting and avoiding, who
N-
your mom was or wasn't and your dad was or wasn't? Like, what was that
Yeah,
like?
no, that was a constant battle in my own mind. And that is where I had to learn to really forgive myself. I had to learn that none of it was my fault. And I acted and reacted exactly how I would have been expected to based on my circumstances. But it's also when I realized that even though that was the case, it was now my responsibility. So I
Mm,
love that expression, with awareness comes great responsibility, because
mm,
when I didn't know why I was acting the way I was acting, it would have been completely normal, and people would have expected that I raised my kids just the way I was raised, or that I went the polar opposite, that I never tried to find this healthy balance. And that's why it's generational. Going back to that, that's why it happens generation after generation. But I picked little things. I mean, the old saying, what's the easiest way to eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I would
yeah,
focus on one thing, because
yeah,
if I let everything come in at the same time, it would literally overwhelm me.
yeah,
So when my 2-year old was acting out as a normal 2-year old should and they're expected to do, and I hesitated to say punish him because I didn't want to be too tough. I wanted to be his
mm,
friend. I wanted him to know that I loved him. I It was like that I would stop myself and say, "Okay, I could do it this way, but then I'm just reiterating what was done to me, or I'm doing the exact opposite." So it was
yeah,
literally like I self-analyzed through the whole process, and in every single step I had to remind myself, you're not perfect, and no parent is perfect
yeah,
ever.
yeah, yeah. Oof. And that's hard. I think that's, I don't know if did you know that every mom wrestles with that, or did you feel like it was just you because of your past? Because I didn't have your past and I wrestle with that as a mom, right? Like,
And no, I think I think we all wrestle with it. I've
we
had
all
people
do,
that um I go back to the story. I don't know if I told the story on this podcast or not, but my husband's nurse in the hospital stapled him or pinned him to a diaper, and he has a big scar to this day, 54 years later. And this was a woman who was a professional baby taker carer.
oh my goodness.
So, you know what I'm saying? Like, nobody's perfect,
Yeah.
but we expect ourselves to be perfect. And I think the expectation when you're growing up with that kind of chaos and turmoil and no role model is,
Yeah.
you expect that you're going to be able to, okay, well, I read all the books now, so I'm going to be able to be better. I'm going to be better than perfect. And
Yeah.
it's just, I mean, perfectionism is something that, especially when you grew up with in survival mode, you taught
Yeah.
yourself that your worth is based on your production, or your ability to do things, or your ability to show the world how good you are.
Mm,
Otherwise, you're no good. So
yeah.
there's no I'm just an average mom. You're either going to be the best or you're going to be the worst.
Uh,
It's that complete version. So yes, I wrestled with it all the time, but
yeah.
in every step, I did compare myself a lot. And what
Yeah.
I found, compared myself to a lot of other parents. I was in the military at the time. My husband was in the military. So I had a lot of little kids around me. And I found that they were all making mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well, I'm
that
glad you
made
at
it,
least you could recognize it in the moment, right? Like hopefully it brought some freedom of like, oh yeah. And I think to me, I think this is to me why it's so important we have these kind of podcasts and these kind of conversations. And even why like we don't have to relate to the exact circumstances to relate to the emotional fear,
oh,
the
yeah.
like need to be accepted or to fear rejection. Like all of us are tempted to feel like we're not enough, we're doing it wrong, we should be someplace else, right?
Yep.
And when we can like lower that significance of the like it's all or nothing, right? You're either a
Right.
terrible mom or you're the best mom. There's so much pressure. So I'm glad that you had people around you that you could at least see in the moment of like, okay, we're all kind of wrestling with some of these things. But I wonder, what would you say to the woman who is really plagued or held back by this belief that they really can't be successful because of their past? Like how much was that like really holding you back personally? Or the people that you work with, like, do you hear that often from people?
Well, and it's almost like the self-sabotaging system
Mm,
where, you've been told your whole life you'll never be more than this, you're never going to amount to anything, you're never going to do anything. You have this big sense of unworthiness. And to me, it was almost like I was on a mission to prove people wrong.
mm,
I was on this, I'm going to be the best because they're wrong. But
yeah.
it does plague you, and you do start to kind of self-sabotage because you might have this belief that I'm never going to be anything. So then all of a sudden you start to become something, and it's uncomfortable because your brain thinks I can't do I was told I can't do that. So you do have this habit of self-sabotaging, honestly, when you get to those next step levels. But there's fear. I had just had a podcast this morning, and we were talking about, like, fear runs everything, and fear, the
Mm,
opposite of hate, of love, is not hate, it's fear, and it's fear of anything. But I've talked to people that have been on 5,000 stages, and they say, I, I don't know what I would do if I ever stopped getting those butterflies, because those butterflies and that adrenaline rush is what gives me that short term energy to get through it in a ultra focused way, kind of like taking a what's that, Adderall or something, and
yeah.
so you think about that, and that's what your body's response is to do. It's to give it that short term rush. So fear is not necessarily a bad thing. It's learning how to understand. Someone told me today, instead of it false evidence appearing real, they look at it as facing everything and resolving, or something like that. Facing everything and whatever the next word was, but it was literally, don't avoid it. Avoiding
Yeah.
it is getting you nowhere. So
Yeah.
face it and resolve it, and then move forward, because you're going to have fear. There's no,
Yeah.
if you were a parent and you weren't afraid that you were going to do something wrong, there's a good chance you'd probably kill your kid because you wouldn't be even
Yeah.
aware of what you were supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
But it
Like, there's a
but I think
healthy
it's
fear out there to keep
there.
us on the right path. It's a protection.
It absolutely is, but I think it's when it's so ingrained in you that you can't do it, that you really, or
Yeah.
you've heard it so long that this is the way it just is. I've heard so many people say to me, I grew up that way. It just is. It's just what was destined to be. Those are the people I want to reach, and those are the people that I go torn between, like loving and strangling, because you're like, no, like only you can decide your destiny. What happened to you is not you. It's just what happened to you.
Yeah.
And I even tell people, don't, I've had people introduce themselves, oh, yeah, well, I'm an adult child. And it's like, okay, that might just be a term, but it also might be you giving yourself excuse to be the way you are and for it to be okay.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
there's, yeah, so much of it is choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the right kind of fear. I think that's what I hear in your thing. Like, what are we going to use the fear to do? I remember some coaching that I had received that I really liked, and they were like, be up to something worth being upset about.
Mm,
Right? Like, I was just so fearful of making mistakes. Like, I think that was part of my role. I was like, let me just keep it really small and simple. And I felt like if I
mhm.
could just control my environment and do, like, don't rock the boat, don't step, like, don't risk anything. Like, what's the safest thing I can do? But
Yeah,
I found myself so miserable, and I didn't have purpose, and I didn't have anything to like motivate. And I just let fear kind of crush me, as opposed to what I hear you're saying, like, we could use that fear to really put us up to something that will bring long-term satisfaction for sure, but also be used in a helpful way to
yeah.
help us to overcome and to not be deterred by it. Like, are we fearing to avoid, or are we fearing and embracing and being able to be along that journey
Right.
is, and that's where we all have to wrestle, right? And I think that's what I love so much about just humanity, like that I feel like we can all relate in. But then it also really helps to have someone who specifically did walk down your path, right? Like you're going to
Right.
automatically connect to the woman who was just like you, and to have those moments of like, oh my gosh, me too, is also very powerful and helpful.
And it's funny because I remember my dad said to me once when after I was married and I was actually, I think, in the middle of my first divorce. And I just remember saying, I'm okay. I'm okay. And I remember him saying, Tammy, do you want to do something absolutely amazing? And he's like, yeah. He's like, and I said, yeah. He's like, then get out of your comfort zone. He said, because
Mm,
unfortunately, and he said that to me, your comfort zone is very small and very limited because you haven't had a comfortable life. So
yeah.
your comfort zone is here. He's like, get outside of it because nothing amazing happens in your comfort zone. That's why they call it comfort and they don't call it your joyous zone or your thriving
Mm,
zone. He said, so
yeah.
get out of it. And I was like, but he didn't add on because since then I've done so much growing. It's like, yes, you can step out of your comfort zone and they say do it fearful and everything else. But like you said, look at the fear as what are you going to learn from it and what are you going to do with it versus just running from it, because
Yeah.
that is why we self-sabotage. You go,
Yeah.
okay, I'm gung-ho, I got this great idea, and then bam, you hit a wall and you're like, that's not going to work, and you run because that's
Yeah.
what our brains want to do to keep us safe.
Yeah. We really do. Okay. I have a question for you. It's totally different, but I want to hear, you've given me two examples of your dad impressing upon you some really valuable wisdom. And so, but in your story, I thought, was your dad also an addict too? Or tell me a little bit more about your relationship with your dad, if you don't mind.
No, that's okay. So my dad he was also an alcoholic, but he was the
Okay.
kindest, gentlest soul ever.
Mhm.
But he was tormented. He
Yeah.
was in Vietnam. He saw horrible things. He probably had the worst case of PTSD. We can imagine, but he hid everything. He was the stoic man. So
Mm,
where my kids even said they would spend the night at his house and they loved my dad, like that's where they wanted to be, was at their grandparents or at their great grandmother's
mm,
house. That's where they wanted to be. And but Jessie said to me one day, that was my daughter, she was about 10, and she said, I love sleeping at grandpa's, but I'm so sad when he falls asleep. And I said, well, that's kind of weird, but okay, what, tell me more. And she said because they always would make a fort on his floor next to his bed, and they would all sleep in there, and they would just
aw.
play and eat popcorn and watch movies. And she said the minute he fell asleep, he would start cussing and swearing and yelling and crying. And but when he was awake, and because he was drinking, and she knew, my kids were very used to him falling asleep with scotch next to the bed. He'd had 5 or 6 or 8 scotches every night.
Yeah.
But that broke my heart because it was like he was
Mm,
so tormented, but you would never, ever, ever know it.
wow.
So he did. When I was 13, he told me, he said, your mother and I are doing irreparable damage to you, and I don't know how to help you. And I was like, okay. And that was literally the end of the conversation. But he, he sacrificed his life for us, but at the same, he got out of the Navy. He did, an honorable discharge. He could have gone straight up the ranks and he could have been so successful in what he did, but he sacrificed everything for us, but at the same time emotionally he was not there to give us really anything on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
have zero hard feelings. I really have zero hard feelings from my mother now that I know to the extent that she was tormented, but I never really talked about my past while my dad was living because it would have killed me to hurt his feelings. I
Hmm.
adored him.
Yeah. Yeah. He sounds like a special place and
Yeah.
brought a lot of great comfort to your world. Did your kids spend time with your mom? Did I understand that correctly? Is your mom still living or she's passed on?
No, she passed right the year I got out of high school. She actually died of cirrhosis when she was 42, if that tells you
Wow.
how young it got her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So your kids never knew your mom.
No, they never knew her.
Okay. Did your dad
No.
get remarried then? Who was the
He
grandma that your kids were raised
The
around?
grandma that my kids and raised me basically as much as she could was my dad's mother.
Okay, got you. I was gonna say, I was like, wow, like your kids enjoyed spending time with your mom. Like that didn't seem
No, 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 no.
right.
They actually never knew anybody except my one daughter got close to my mother's sister, who really, she was an alcoholic as well, very
Yeah.
much so. Died pretty young, and 3 months after we went on a cruise with her, but she was pretty much an alcoholic her whole life.
Wow. So I'm curious. There's a friend that I'm thinking of in particular, um, and she's trying to really heal and overcome from a lot of just a very unfortunate, traumatic, a lot of abuse and neglect in her childhood, and still kind of in healthy relationships. And so there's this dichotomy between or a tension of like she's trying to heal herself, but she's also around really unhealthy people. And so it made me just curious so you chose to stop drinking. You were clearly impacted by your parents' addiction, but your dad is still an active alcoholic, but your kids still had a lovely, beautiful relationship with your dad. So maybe if you can speak to us a little bit about maybe like what was the journey like for you, or how do you advise people to have like healthy boundaries when you protect your
Okay.
kids,
I
and when are you putting them in abusive situations, right? Like, how do you figure that out?
Well, I luckily my mother was not alive, so I never had to put my kids in that. I never had that situation where it was an abusive situation that they would have been exposed to. But I
Yeah.
can tell you that in my world, there was some non-negotiables once I started getting better. Like if I knew somebody, I had an uncle that I knew for a fact that he had sexually molested my dad actually as a
Oh,
child.
yeah.
I would have never let my children by him, near him.
Mm,
Never. And we had opportunities where, do you want to go see this uncle? No, never. I will never let my children near them. I will never let him have a relationship. So there was some definitely non-negotiables in my world.
yeah.
When you're dealing with it, and it's very hard. Like
Yeah.
I can only imagine. Like I would not have let. Now my father, when he drank quite a bit in front of my children, but I knew how he acted. I would have
Yeah.
never taken my children in front of my mom as an
Mm,
adult.
yeah.
And to me, I was like, uh, I remember when my son was 5 years old and we had a Christmas party at the house, at my husband's house, or I guess he was like 7, and we
Okay.
drank quite a bit. And I remember my 7-year old, who's now 29, he said to me, Mommy, I don't like it when you're like that. Like, I don't like that
Mm,
when you're like that. And it literally was like, that was like, boom, because I didn't want that role model for my kids. And so being near toxic people, like if I knew somebody was always going to be drinking and always going to be obnoxious, like I just wouldn't,
yeah.
I would have to set that boundary for my own kids because you don't know when it gets out of hand.
Yeah.
I remember we had a friend, and I only had really one friend from kindergarten to fourth grade because our parents drank together. So it wasn't embarrassing when stupid things happened because she was used to it. But
Yeah.
I remember being at a party at a picnic at their house, and one of the girls got hit in the head with a baseball bat, accidentally, of course, but nobody was sober enough to take her to the hospital.
Oh
And I
no.
remember sitting here scared to death. I would think I was in third grade. I remember thinking, this girl is going to die because nobody can drive this girl to the hospital. And I remember thinking at that moment, like, or later on, like, I will never put anybody I'm involved in that situation. So
Yeah.
with boundaries are very tough,
Yeah.
but you're right. They're very hard to instill when you've never had them. If you've
Yeah.
got that mother that drinks and now all of a sudden you've got these children and you say, hey, if you're going to be drinking, we're not coming. And then you show up and she starts drinking, you have to be it's very, very difficult, but you have to just let them know. I mean, you have to do what your integrity leads you to do.
Yeah.
And the very first step in that is figuring out what those boundaries are because most people don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it sounds like even too, you're saying like you got to take care of, you had to have your own boundaries first, right? Even
Hmm.
like in your own home, how are you going to show up? How are you raising your children? What's the standard? And then when we're talking about bringing other people in, how do your kids feel? Or do your kids feel safe? What kind of people
Right.
are they like? what's the level of exposure are we, you weren't going in blind, or just or even expecting somebody to behave differently than the way they've always shown up, right?
Right.
So knowing how your dad even responded when drinking, like, that makes a lot of sense of, what kind of personality comes out and what they're dealing with, and how to be still loving and empathetic. I love that your kids had a good relationship with your family,
Yes.
and through all of that is really
Yep.
amazing.
And the other thing I think too is a lot of people that are listening to this that are kind of at those beginning stages, I think it's
Mhm.
very important. They might not know what is important to them, but my best
Mhm.
thing is we were born with a gut instinct.
Yeah.
And that is what we've been fighting our whole lives because we've been told not to listen to it. And my
Yeah.
best advice is to start listening to your gut instinct again. If something feels wrong, it probably is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and just know that you have a very small group of people that are so important to you to protect. So if it feels wrong having to do with those people,
Yeah.
I don't want to say screw everybody else, but that's how I kind of looked at it. Like
Yeah.
this is my tribe. I'm going to, mother hen this group right here. And everybody else, I'm sorry, it's not to hurt you, it's to save them.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's the motivation? Well, and what would you say to help somebody to distinguish between it being like trusting your gut, but not avoiding doing a hard thing, right? Because it's kind of like it's a tricky line where we're just making excuses to avoid growing. That's uncomfortable and it's hard and it's scary. But setting boundaries is also like, all of it's hard. So how do you know when it's like the time to go forward or the time to pause?
I'm a list person. I'm such a list person. Like I'm a pro con person. And I remember even when people ask me, when you say to someone, and there's a lot of people out there right now, if you say to them, who are you? They don't know.
Yeah,
So I don't know if we talked about this earlier, but if you,
I think we did.
when
Yeah.
our first conversation, but
Yeah.
we have like our, the good qualities of that you want to see in someone and then the bad qualities or the good attributes you want in your life and the bad things. And it was very like, okay, you know where you want to be. So if it's your children's safety, every
Yeah.
time you run into a fork in the road and you have to make a decision,
Yeah.
process that end goal. And if it doesn't help you get there, it's not good. And so again, I know it sounds so harsh to say non-negotiables, but to
Yes.
me they were.
Yeah.
If I was going to die if I got in the car with my mother, I didn't do that. And
Yeah.
like if I had to put my children in a car with that my mother, I would
Yeah.
never have done that because no, I want my kids, their end goal is their happiness. And
Yeah.
them getting in the car with you is not attributing to that happiness if something happens.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
literally was like a list person. So when it came down to like a boundary with a parent, say, and a
Yeah.
lot of those, there's a lot of those. And I'm actually doing a summit right before Christmas because I think there's a lot of that
Mhm.
tension and that mental health issues is tougher around the holidays sometimes because a lot of times you're with the family that caused you to have the mental health issues to begin with. So
Yes.
there's a lot of boundary setting and a lot of boundary breaking and everything else around the holidays from guilt and shame.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
just, it's your mother, so you have to excuse it. Well, no, you don't. Not if it doesn't help your mental well-being. You don't.
Yeah.
So again, I literally had pros and cons lists for everything. I was a big
I love
list. I was a check it off. If it doesn't go in the plus list, it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's so much value in that, because then you're not just overwhelmed and confused, right? Because then it's easy for it to all just feel like all or nothing. And then it's vague and it's just this unknown feeling, as opposed to some concrete, we know what we're trying to go towards, we know what we're trying to avoid. And I wonder, as you were even describing that, I thought, if you're feeling like you're compromising in some way, then it's probably a sign to trust your gut. And you don't need to
Hmm.
compromise,
Right.
right? Like that we can like be supportive of one another. Like there is a way to support each other, but we don't have to compromise our safety or compromise our children or do something that we're gonna, how do you not go in having regret I
Right.
think of kind of like being able to just be really clear, like if we're going to go do this, then feel secure. Like this is the decision I made. I can
Yes.
confidently say, yes, we're going to go do this, or no, we're not going to do that.
And it is, setting, and especially a lot of times too, when I tell people, especially going into a tough situation, is make sure the expectations are there ahead of time.
Yeah.
Like if you have, and a lot of people have that with their parent slash children slash relatives in general, but
Yeah.
this could possibly happen. I know. I mean, I was very open with my children about my father's drinking, and my parent children knew why my mother had passed. They didn't hear really a lot of details until just recently, because this is when a lot of my story came out. But they knew the risk. They always knew the risk of being, a fifth generation alcoholic, really, you could call them, because I look back on my father's side, and short of my grandmother, I could never find anybody that wasn't a drinker
Yeah.
anywhere in our lineage,
Yeah.
and my mother's side, really.
Yeah. So, what advice? You brought up the holidays, and so we're getting ready to come into that time. What would be maybe like one piece of advice, or maybe a more specific example for them of like, I don't know, the woman who is now trying to change that generation that is feeling like, how can you still be around your family knowing that they're going to do unhealthy, unhelpful things versus like, do you be with the family or do you not be with the family? I guess what's on that pros and cons list? What are
Uh,
things
I
to
think
consider?
it's I think it's very important to, if you can salvage a relationship, do it. I don't think it's good advice for anybody to ever say walk away, without trying, without setting those boundaries, without communicating the boundaries, without,
Um,
I've had people say, I have people all the time that are like, oh my gosh, I'm going to see my brother and I'm so stressed out because this is going to come up. Well, then
yeah,
you work with your spouse or you work with your children and you say, this is a conversation I won't have. And if it comes up, just be prepared. We're going to be leaving, or
yeah,
prep the person involved, and know in your mind that that's, I mean, it's a lot of prep, a lot of mantras, a lot of deep breathing. I do tell people, because it sometimes will throw people into a full-blown anxiety attack,
yeah,
just walking. A good example is people that are trying to have a baby, or grandma wants a baby and there's not a baby coming, and that's a
yeah,
subject that is just tense. Well, learn how to, first get on your spouse on board or whoever else is involved on your side. But
yeah,
when it comes up, quickly nip things in the bud. Like, don't let it, these little jabs at you, six, seven times before you say enough is enough.
yeah,
Um, but also, have a technique, have something that can calm you in the moment, whether
yeah,
it's, box breathing or something, a certain pressure point that can bring a little bit of peace to yourself, or, some simple vagal toning exercise where you can just calm yourself a little bit. Because
yeah,
especially if you've come from a place of trauma and you're not yet at that place, you're also reacting from that little child you.
yeah, yeah,
So it's like you've got this mother who inflicted this or whatever, or this father who inflicted this stuff. And now when they say something, it triggers you, and you're literally like snapping back as a 5-year-old having a temper tantrum, which is what
yes,
happens.
yeah, yes. Well, and I would assume this would apply in this same kind of dynamic. I think um, being able to recognize, so if this is your first holiday going into that situation, right, like what I hear from you is saying like really do the work before you show up, and in that
Yes.
fear, right, like let's not avoid, like we can't just bury our head in the sand and just hope for the best that it's not, that it's somehow magically going to be different this year, right? Like how about we go in with realistic expectations
Mm-hmm.
and do as much work as you can ahead of time. If you're in a space you can verbalize the boundaries, then do it. But I guess if you can, at least know your boundaries and
Yes.
your limits, have a plan in place. And then I think I hear what you're saying, if you would also agree with this, is that even if it doesn't go well this holiday, like it doesn't mean you don't just have one shot, right? Like, so
Right.
again, you get to keep practicing that. Get to keep practicing your boundaries and keep giving your family second chances. And I guess maybe it's not a clear path or a formula of when enough is enough, when it's time to cut off. How do we keep moving forward? Any advice on that of like how many
Um,
chances do you allow parents to have, you know?
it honestly depends on the situation because let's say for instance you're dealing with a completely narcissistic parent or father or mother or whatever it is. And
Yeah.
the general trait of that person is you will never win, you'll never
Yeah.
be right, and every single interaction with them is going to make you leave feeling this small and that you did something wrong. Those honestly, I can't even imagine
Yeah.
trying because it's a lose-lose situation for you
Yeah.
because there's no rationalizing. Now, if you have a parent that just drinks sometimes and they don't understand that what they do really hurts you, then you have, you owe it to yourself and you owe it to the relationship and to your kids to try to have some kind of relationship to say, "Hey mom, I'd appreciate you don't do this in front of my children. If you do XYZ." And then
Yeah.
that's on them. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I never reconciled with my mother. She, but honestly, the last probably 4 years, she was so out of it. I don't even think she knew the pain that she inflicted.
Yeah.
But there was never an apology. She was never there. But you're talking a lot of parents too, or siblings, or brothers, or whatever, are also in recovery. And
Yeah.
so I say, look at that from a compassionate, empathetic eye, because when you're in recovery, oh, you better believe you've got so much work to do on you. And so much of that includes the guilt and the shame of the things you did when you were misbehaving. So there's
Yeah.
all of these dynamics. So there's no easy answer. I always just kind of say, just try to be as compassionate as possible with every situation. And this is to yourself and to the
Yeah.
other person.
Yeah.
Because if you're feeling uncomfortable, there's a good chance they are too.
Yeah.
If they
Yeah.
are not, and they are that high-end narcissistic person, then it doesn't matter what you say to them.
Yeah.
It's not going to make a
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah. Almost like stop trying to fix it because it's
Yeah,
just
you can't. It's not fixable. I mean, there are some times where, I mean, I can remember having fights with my mother, and literally she would do something horrible, and by the end I was practically on my knees begging her for forgiveness, and I'm like, how does this
mm,
even happen? And I
yeah.
was a child and a teenager, but I'm like, oh, as an adult
Yeah.
I see it happen all the time to people, and I'm like, no, like, no,
Yeah.
you've got to save your own mental health.
Yeah. 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 I love that. Well, thank you so much for all of those great nuggets and sharing your story. If somebody wants to work with you, like tell me a little bit about your coaching, where they can find you, and if you want to share any last like wisdom with somebody that you want to leave them with, I would love to hear it.
Well, I do one-on-one, and I'm restarting another group coaching program. I really just work with anybody where they're at and what they need. So some people want to be in a group of 3 or 4 people. Some people just want to talk one-on-one. I do a combination of everything. I have a very different theory on, I feel like if you grew up in this kind of dysfunction, you have already paid the price. So I try to make
Mhm.
everything accessible to everybody. I have an 8-week guided course, which also gives you full access to me via Messenger the entire time you're going through it. Um, the whole premise of what I do is letting people know that they're not alone and that they could be 20, 30, 40, 50, or 60, 70, doesn't matter. There's always room for introspection and there's always room for being curious about the better things that are out there. So the best place to reach me is literally just go to my website, which is just my name, tammyvincent.com, and reach out and chat because every journey is so unique.
Yeah.
And I work however you need it to be. Um, that I think we're all worth it. And I think that's my message to kind of end this with is so many people are stuck in this, it just is.
Yeah.
And and I say this with love, but also with kind of a toughness. It just is because we're allowing it to be. Like,
Yeah.
happiness is a choice. Moving forward, growth is a choice. And it's not always, they say the hardest things, the hardest things are the most productive. Like you
Yeah.
might take, I did 6 years of inner child work, but I can now picture my little self next to me on a bench when I'm sad and just be like, it's okay, baby, we got this. And
Yeah.
it's right there. So I do have a lot of tips and tricks that can help out, but we need to
Yeah.
know in our heart that we are worth it. And until you do a little bit of work, you might know it emotionally or and you might know it like logically, but you don't
Yeah.
know it in your subconscious. And that is the goal. So,
Yes, I love it. Like be able to know all of it across the board. I like that distinction, even like between the mental and emotional. Like logically, it can make sense, but if our heart doesn't believe it,
yep.
right? And you're like, how do we align all of it? We have to be in complete alignment with that belief to
Yep.
really push through.
And the other thing I will say, and then I will end because I'm sure you're really like, okay, stop talking. But
Right.
is the work, you can read all the journals, you can read all of the books, you can read all of the everything you want. It does not work unless you work it. So know that knowing that journaling is a great process and very transformational doesn't work unless you put your pen to the paper.
Hmm.
So that is why I think it's so very important to find the right support group, whether it be a friend, a coach, a therapist, whatever it is,
Yeah.
that's going to hold you accountable and help you get through when you want to give up, because our brains are wired to run. Our
Yeah.
brains are wired, they're wired to survive. And doing the
Yeah.
hard things seems to your brain like it's not growth, it's running. I mean, so
Yeah.
that's my advice, because all the books in the world and all the logical knowledge does not apply the steps.
Yeah. I love that. Well, and I would say my takeaway in this, one of the things that stuck out for me was just even hearing your distinction of like, we can't avoid the fear. Like, all of it is scary, right? Like, life just is hard and all of it is scary. What are we going to do with that fear? What are we going to do to still feel like we can have a say in our future and to find healing? Like, we can't change our past, but we can change our future, right? We
Absolutely.
can change the story for ourselves, but it will be scary. It's just a different kind of scary. So let's get,
Look at, your brain, honestly, your brain doesn't know the difference between scary and excitement. So your
mm,
brain does exactly the same thing whether you're running from a monster or going down a roller coaster. Your brain has
mm,
the exact same physiological process.
sense.
So
Yeah.
learn to reframe things in an excitement kind of way versus an I'm scared kind of way.
Yes. I like that. That's a good distinction. Wow. Well, Tammy, thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, for your vulnerability, and just sharing your story. I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and I'm so glad I could share you with my audience today.
Well, thank you for letting me come, Kylie. I loved it. I loved our conversation.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope that brought you a lot of encouragement and some information to be able to apply to your own life and to start taking down those walls that are in your way. What is that one thing that you want to take on and take with you today? I would love to hear from you and to hear about it. Follow me here on the podcast so that you're alerted and don't miss any upcoming episodes. You can find me on Instagram or even on my website at beyondthewallspodcast.com. If you want more help, I offer one-on-one coaching and would love to connect with you. Until next time, have a great day.